Tēnā koutou katoa, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to this episode, a special US election episode of A View from Afar. Now, clearly this was a decisive and historical win by the United States President-elect Donald Trump. The Electoral College vote, for example, reads 312 for Trump and 226 for Kamala Harris. And the mood of the United States nation is best shown perhaps in the popular vote, which reads 74,547,000 votes for Trump and 70,871,000 votes for Harris. Now that all boils down to 3.6 million more votes for Trump than his Democratic opponent. On top of this, a red wave has swept through the Senate in the states that were up for election in 2024. And currently, Trump's Republicans are close to taking the House of Representatives with 213 seats to the Democrats' 205. But remember that has still been counted and either party needs 218 seats for the control of the House. So whichever way you look at this, it's a landslide victory for Donald Trump. And I would argue, and it'll be interesting to hear Paul's take, who's coming up, it's a win and a landslide victory for Trumpism as well. So today, as I mentioned Paul, political scientist Paul Buchanan and I will discuss, and here are the talking points. Why Democrats lost, and our discussion points will include incumbency, elitism, class and alienation, and identity politics. And then there's obviously the question of why Trump won, which would include in our discussion anti-establishment, the anti-incumbency movement that we've seen around the world, populism, and arguably is Trump, it's an open question for debate, is Trump an avatar for the alienated in the context of the United States election? And what to expect next? Now that's the tricky one, but we get an understanding perhaps from where Trump has nailed down himself onto different policies, potentially where he may go with respect to isolationism and what that means, the geopolitical impact on the major security bodies like NATO, and also the geopolitical response to a Trump-led United States. And also we will look at what appointments that have been made so far while Trump's transition team and himself go through who may get significant portfolios. And there's been a couple of indications of who will not, and also a couple of indications on who may do, including also decisions on the Chief of Staff. But first, remember, if you're joining us live via the social media platforms, jump over to YouTube. It's the best one for interacting with us in the live capacity, and we'd really like to see you there. So if you come across to YouTube or you're on YouTube, please do at this stage subscribe, give us a like if you like it, down if you don't, and make comments. But remember that your comments may be used in this broadcast. So let's cross to Paul, who is waiting online, and we're going to deep dive into all of these issues. Kia ora koutou, Paul. How are you today, my friend?
Oh, I'm waking up from a long hangover, brother. I'll tell you. And without a shred of drinking in between. So, yeah, it's, let's put it this way, Selwyn. I got a PhD in political scientist, and I might as well be a wino in the street when it comes to predicting this election. I got it all wrong. I thought Harris would win by about 5 points, riding the backs of women repudiating the repeal of Roe versus Wade. It was as simple as that. I thought women were going to come to the fore and kick his butt. Boy,
You're not
was I
alone
wrong.
in that. Not alone though, are you? There's many.
Oh no,
many.
I don't know a political scientist who predicted this. Not a single one. I'm not an Americanist. I'm more comparative in international relations. I don't know a single one who predicted this the way the polls were more or less calling it. So let's just take that with, as so much for the value of my degree. Prestigious university notwithstanding, I might as well have been a wino opinionating.
I'd just add it's been an asset in the past, and no doubt in the future it'll come back to benefit us all.
I don't know. I think my kid said it best. He goes, "I think the bad man's gonna win."
He got it.
He got it. So
yeah.
But
well, let's just as we're introducing it, let's just bring up a map, and it should pop up in about a second or two. Here we go. As those that can see that are joining us live and also on demand later, whether it be in the next few days or in a year's time, this is what we're talking about, that solid red wave, but also significantly the battleground states, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, all tipping to the Republicans under Donald Trump's presidency. Just while we're here, Paul, I might as well just bring up the Senate so people can, hopefully I can get that. Yep. There's the Senate. And remember that not all states, this is correct, isn't it, Paul, compete for the Senate in one election. It's kind of staggered. So that you can see that those that aren't or weren't up for grabs are the ones in grey, and the ones that have come through are coloured, obviously. And you can see by the the kind of diagonal lines, like in Ohio, West Virginia, etc., those are the ones that have tipped toward the Republicans. And there's still Arizona out for the count at the moment, waiting for those final counts to be there. But the Republicans have control of the Senate with 52 seats. They required 51. Now what we're looking at is the House of Representatives. All of them are up for grabs. That's correct, isn't it, Paul?
It is.
And you can see just how red the United States is. But remember, by way of population, that a lot of those blue centres are centres where there is a city and intense population in evidence. So, and also, I should have said in the Senate too that you can see Vermont, and am I correct, in Maine also tipped independent in the Senate. Is that? Yeah. So what we're waiting for, obviously, in the House is for a number of states to come through. The Republicans are well ahead with 213, like we said in the introduction, 205 to the Democrats. Either party needs 218 to control the House. And why is this all significant? Well, let's get back to Paul, because a Trump administration having control of the Senate, perhaps the House as well, perhaps appointments that may come up in the Supreme Court, the ability to have the Commander-in-Chief, Donald Trump, in charge of the world's biggest and most powerful military, also to make appointments in the judiciary with respect to the intelligence community and internal national security. It's a pretty powerful position, isn't it, that in the hands of one man. So that's what we're facing with at the moment, Paul. So I just wanted to bring that in so that we could all begin with that foundation of fact of where we sit today on the November 11 New Zealand time 2024.
Yeah, and you can see in that the map of the House seats, the rural-urban divide that cleaves the United States in this day and age. I mean, that's pretty impressive. New Mexico is an outlier because it's a mostly rural state that traditionally has gone Democrat, but look at that sea of red. Those are mostly rural states. So we have that. But let me just give you my 2 cents on this to begin with, and then get a little deeper. For the Democrats, for the voters of the Democrats, people like me, it's a calamity. It's an absolute calamity, but it's a mandate for them. If he wins the House, there's no disputing the legitimacy. I've had Democratic friends say, oh, they must have cheated because there was a 15 million vote swing between the 2020 presidential results and what we got today. Trump only lost 1.5 million votes compared to 2020. Harris lost 15 to 16 million votes. Now, many of them may have just stayed home, not happy with either candidate, but the Democrats are going to have to reflect upon that to lose that amount of people against this particular candidate. But be it as it may, my calamity is their mandate, and we're going to wear those consequences immediately, especially if he does what he said he will do, which it'll be a dictator on the first day. I wouldn't want to be an immigrant on that first day, but we shall see. The key, and I'll anticipate this, the key is that he's got 2 years to push this mandate, because then we have the midterm elections. And that will either consolidate or challenge the MAGA takeover, not only of the Republican Party, but of the politics of the country. Because that's what this was. This was a MAGA takeover of political discourse in this country. But let me say, and again, I've written a Geopolitical post about this, so I won't repeat every detail. But let me tell you what did not matter in the 2024 elections. Yeah, and that's the post. If people want to read it, again, it's fairly long, Geopolitical.com, you can find it there. So what did not matter? Well, let me start out with the fact that what didn't matter was the old adage that the politics of hope beat the politics of fear. In fact, Trump's politics of fear, I might say hate, beat the politics of hope offered by Harris. Now, she may have been vague, and that could have caused a problem, but that political science adage, was not proven true. What did not matter was that she raised over $1 billion and outspent Trump at least twofold in the elections. It turns out having a lot of campaign money is overrated. She lost. What does not matter is she had celebrity endorsements. Everybody from Bruce Springsteen to Taylor Swift. It did not matter. Not at all. He had Kid Rock and Hulk Hogan, and he won. All right? It did not matter that hundreds of former military officials, diplomats, high-ranking civil servants, intellectuals, poets, academics, hundreds of them, including people who worked in his administration, who said that he was unfit to be president. That did not matter. It didn't matter that he's a convicted felon, an adjudicated sexual predator, a guy who race baits, who was performing simulated fellatio on his microphone in one of the last rallies. None of that matters. So character issues do not matter. Maybe they matter for a woman, because it turns out the U.S. has a serious problem electing females to the presidency. So maybe character matters in the case of a female candidate, because let's be honest, Kamala Harris, who has experience at the local, state, and federal level in all three branches of government. She's been in the judiciary, she's been in the legislature, and she's been in the executive branch. All of these experiences mattered for no. She was considered, and she was framed by the GOP as a diversity hire who slept her way to the top. All right? They smeared her.
And extreme.
And extreme. So
yeah.
There's something about the American psyche when it comes to women. I would have imagined that a lot of men would not hear their mothers or their sisters or their daughters smeared in the way Harris was, and yet for 70 million people, that was acceptable discourse in a presidential race. I could go on and go on, but what did not matter seems to me to be fundamental to the outcome. People, we could say it's false consciousness and many things, and we'll discuss maybe the mistakes in the Democrat tactics. But none of the traditional shibboleths of politics mattered in the end. And again, it reduces to character doesn't matter. But what did matter was the very successful framing by the Republicans, by MAGA, of what was at stake in this election. And it was all what we call in academia superstructural. They had talked about the economy, but that's not what mattered. The fact is, at a macroeconomic level, the US economy is doing very, very well.
Yeah,
Inflation is not, oh, no, but all the macroeconomic indicators
we
are
had
up.
this discussion, didn't we, Paul? Late
Yeah,
last week, and
including in
what we can see is that this is a common thing all over the world. That the macroeconomic indicators say things are returning to normal. That inflation is down within band. All of the accomplishments that are accurately measured by the administration, by the Biden administration, should be and could be and was heralded up there as an indicator of being on the right direction. That was not accepted by a very large majority in the exit polls, perhaps in each state, and also, on the ABC map that we brought up there, gives strong indications of not believing that. So what we're left with is, I think, a person like we had in our discussions, a person who is sitting there thinking, well, my grocery bill is a lot higher. My bread is so expensive. The gas in the tank of my SUV or my vehicle is absolutely at sky-high levels compared to what it was 4 years ago. If that economic response and that recovery is happening, and I believe the government, when it says it is, well, where's it going? Because it's not reaching me. And Paul, in our conversations, I think we came to that point where in that type of situation, there are clearly millions who felt estranged or alienated from the party that is supposed to represent working class values and concerns. It was looked like there was mass abandonment of acknowledging or even listening or hearing what that large band of people were feeling and saying, and it was there for anyone to see. And I'll just add, before I pass it back to you, that Kamala Harris campaigned very strongly for the middle class. Now, I might be wrong. I listened to many, many, many hours of her campaigns, as I did with Trump, but I didn't hear her mention the working class pain. So perhaps Bernie Sanders has got something there that this, at the fundamental level, maybe it's an election that exposes alienation and class over identity politics and elitism. That's how my feeling is on this.
Okay, no, your points are well taken. But let me finish my thoughts on what mattered and didn't matter, because it dovetails into what you're saying. The identity politics mattered, but not in the way that the Democrats expected. You see, for Democrats, the granting of rights to transgender people was considered a civil rights issue. It was merely an extension of the struggles of African Americans, gay Americans in previous decades. What they didn't understand is that for the majority of America, not just red states, this was an existential assault on the nuclear family and raising children. And it was framed that way very effectively by the GOP. They put their money into attacking trans people. I've mentioned him before. I've got a friend in Oklahoma. Incidentally, Oklahoma is the only state in the country where every county went red. The entire place. My poor old friend, Vietnam veteran, is a little blue dot in the middle of that sea. He said to me, we did a post-mortem the day after. And he said, Paul, you have to understand, we were saturated 24/7 with anti-trans ads. They were going to assault our girls in bathrooms. They were going to take over women's sports. The drag queens were going to groom kids by reading to them in libraries, and went on and on and on. And it was relentless. And he said to me, look, you and I both know that transgender people A, are a very small minority, but B, have no history of what they're being accused of. You know, pedophilia is a heterosexual white male sort of thing. But it didn't matter because they were just relentless on transgender are going to take over. And so this, in a way, runs counter to the axiom that bread and butter issues, economic issues, matter most. They did, but these superstructural, these cultural war issues, they mattered a lot
Yeah.
in a lot of places. Now,
And
about the economics, let me just say something about the economics. You were talking about people complaining about the cost of retail goods. These are people who drive $80,000 utes, pickup trucks, dually pickup trucks, $90,000 Lexus SUVs, and they're complaining about the price of eggs. You know, this is all about relative deprivation. They're paying more than they used to, but the United States still has some of the lowest grocery prices in the world. So it was relative to some mythical path. The Republicans framed this very well. Instead of saying you're driving an $80,000 car and you're a fireman, that's pretty good by global standards. They pointed out that the price of eggs, you know, chickens apparently are getting more expensive, and to try to explain that this is the tale of the COVID, supply side, log jams and all of that. That takes too much intellectual effort for the average punter.
Wasn't it Reagan that said it? And there were many other people on the right that have said over the years, you explain, you lose.
Yeah. And so they had the Democrats on that one. If I was the Democrats, I would have pushed back a little bit and said, hey, Joe Biden's infrastructure program, which he directed mostly at red states, he was trying to carve votes away from Trump, has produced record low unemployment, rises in wages. I mean, again, the macroeconomic indicators are all good, but the Republican strategists found an angle. And the angle was inflation, which the president cannot control. I mean, the president does not have the authority to order price controls on supermarkets. Simply does not.
Although she raised the issue of addressing price gouging, that would address this concern that the Democrats had obviously picked up, where the working class were moving off base. And, she was arguing about, well, we can do this, we can put price caps on this type of thing, which was getting rejected by the Republicans, obviously. But it seemed like there was a big shift. When you look at the data, there's clear evidence there that the low socioeconomic voter moved off Democrat base and attached to Trump. There's obviously a matrix involved here too. When we speak to one point, it's almost like we have to actually consider diverse points as well, like the identity politics, looking at the macroeconomic indicators. There's perhaps the macroeconomic indicators raise this issue where to actually feel satisfied that the benefits of what you're seeing are reaching the low socioeconomic communities, you have to believe in trickle down. And in a society and an economy like in the United States, where the disproportionate value of wealth is generated for the top 6% and arguably the very top in many cases, then you have got a problem where it is not getting to the areas where a party like the Democrats would traditionally expect to reach into. And I think I'm just giving a bit of a pushback on that, because it seems to me that this is a universal problem of seeing the same thing with a rejection, an anti-incumbent rejection in the post-COVID periods all over the world. And it does seem to be economically attached in this respect.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with you. The Democrats lost the working class, and I'll get back to it in a second. But let me finish my thought on identity politics and how it works both ways. So the Democrats misread the room, and they pushed certain types of identity politics that the majority rejected. They stretched it too far. On the other hand, some genius in the Trump campaign aided and abetted by a billionaire who used his control of a social media platform to basically disseminate disinformation and pro-Trump propaganda and attack Harris. I will not mention the billionaire nor his platform, but he used it very effectively to poison the well for the Democrats. And then here's the genius aspect. Someone in the Trump campaign looked around at the voter demographic and said, who could we mobilize on identity issues that is traditionally not been mobilized by either party? And the answer is angry young men.
Yeah.
And the Republicans went for the under 35 angry male. They're not all so-called incels, although a lot of them, but this was a post-feminist backlash, aided and abetted by that billionaire, but also people like Tucker Carlson, people like, well, that horrible Andrew Tate, the child trafficking rapist, endorsed Trump, assorted other Republican male figures, using the language of we're alpha males and we're becoming feminized. You're all now a nation of beta males who no longer have testicles. And it's all the fault of pushy woke women and their libtard male, again, beta male friends. Now, you and I, Selwyn, will look at this and go, you know, this is an adolescent's wet dream. But it worked. They turned out in record numbers. Young men turned out in record numbers. They turned out for Trump. And after he won, they reveled in the triumph by going on college campuses with placards that read, "Women are property." What is property? Slavery, dogs, jewelry, and women. Look it up. Southern universities was full of this stuff. This was revenge of the alpha male. People, I won't say that they all could not get laid.
Yeah.
But this is a third. My wife said to me, because she's a second generation feminist, she said this is the backlash against the third wave of feminism.
And some people argued that Trump's first term in office was a white lash against having had Obama, the first black president. You know, some argue that. So there's a lot in what you're saying there. You know, back to you. I just wanted to inject that.
Oh, well, it was a genius strategy. I mean, again, you have to give credit where credit is due. So even though I don't like the outcome, I'm like, man, these guys were smart. I didn't think they had that sort of ground game, to be honest with you.
Nor
but
did
they did.
No one could see it, I don't think. But clearly they did. Yeah.
They saw these cleavages. Maybe the evil hand of Steve Bannon from prison, excuse me, was working there. But they saw the cleavages and they exploited them very effectively. And so what we know is what doesn't matter is money, endorsements, and character. What we do know that matters is being able to exploit disgruntlement, anger, fear, and rage from specific parts of the voting demographic. And that's where the issue of class comes in.
Just before we go on to the class, I just wanted to add in something here, and this is something that hasn't been tested out, Paul, and it's most specifically, I think, to the culture wars / identity politics. Now, we know when Kamala Harris had the first debate with Donald Trump, that she triggered him psychologically. You know, people are leaving your rallies, you know, you're this, you're that. And we knew that had its effect. He was thrown off his pedestal, his game that he took to that debate. She won it so far. And the thing is she was triggering him and controlling that whole debate, even controlling him to a degree. It was something to watch. I thought it was a class act. But there's something that after the election, and I stood back, and I thought to myself, some of the extreme responses coming from the rallies from Trump, and also all of those other people around his orbit that were trying to out-Trump Trump with their extremism. And in that example that you've given there with the angry disenfranchised, feeling compromised in their sexual identity males going onto campus and, waving those placards about. What does that do? It triggers all of those opponents on issues of culture and identity to respond in kind. And I wonder whether or not there was something very clever in the sociological psyche that the Trump people, Trumpism, knew how to spike, that by degrees, even if they're working on the margins, that they are actually going to have people thinking, oh, well, see, they are talking about this. They are talking about trans issues. They are doing this. They are responding in a way of a culture war kind of thing. And really what, the extremism, I don't get it as much as what you do, but it worked in some way. I don't think the voter was turned off to it. I don't say they were turned on to it either, but maybe the answer is there in the response of the opponent. So that's something that really fascinates me, because that can have a lingering legacy effect for elections in the future.
Yeah, actually, what's interesting is that she trounced him in the debate, but it did not matter. Another thing that did not matter. She kicked his rear and then some. It didn't matter, but it mattered behind the scenes. It galvanized his team into action, and they doubled down. Remember that it was after that the supposed assassination attempts started. We've never gotten an investigative report about that first one in particular. He's miraculously cured. Anyway, I won't get into the dodgy circumstances, but the fact is they doubled down, capitalizing on the assassination. Photo op ready as soon as he stood up. And then they went more extreme. His rhetoric started to get more extreme. They're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. Yeah. None of this craziness mattered, okay? People were already determined to vote a certain way because of issues that you've mentioned. That's why the class stuff starts creeping in. I think it's correct, and Bernie was correct, but you and I have talked about this for as long as this podcast is run. We have said, and we look at it from afar, that if you look objectively, the American voting demographic is getting younger and more lefty, and browner for that matter. So the natural tendency of the Democrats should be to shift leftwards in order to accommodate this emerging demographic. And that could lock them in to generations of Democratic control of Congress if they shift to the left. And this is what Bernie Sanders has been saying for a long time. Instead, the corporate Democrat faction, led by the Obamas, led by the Clintons, led by Nancy Pelosi back in the day, they adhere to that centrist line. Try to be Republicans light, instead let them go extremist MAGA, but be the voice of reason the way Nelson Rockefeller was, the way Mitt Romney is. Try to be like that. And it didn't work. When confronted with the politics of fear as enunciated by Trump, however cognitively difficult he is these days. Again, it mattered for Biden that he was stumbling in his old age. It didn't matter that Trump is a raving lunatic talking about Hannibal Lecter and other sundry things. It did not matter. And that's because I think you're absolutely right. The working class and the lower middle class, let's be honest, white collar workers are just working people. In the United States, like New Zealand, there is an aversion to call people working class or blue collar. The only people who accept that as a badge of honor are union workers. But most people prefer to be called middle class. It makes them feel comfortable about their lifestyles. But they gave up on them. And they didn't understand how certain cultural mores were really important to low information voters. By that I mean non-college educated, working class people. No offense to them. It's just traditional values matter. I happen to think that Trump scratched an itch, and he got the response he wanted. That itch was in fact a scab that, when he tore it off, unveiled the rot of racism, xenophobia, misogyny. But here I am, an overeducated, quote unquote, coastal elite. And so maybe I'm just overthinking the thing, but I think no, he scratched the itch. The root cause was this rot that has existed in the US polity. It never went away. And he's now scratched it back out into the open. And as a campaign strategy, it worked. It worked brilliantly. And I don't think they're going to put that genie back in the bottle. So the question is this: is the MAGA moment a fork in the road of American politics, and it will be consolidated by the 2026 midterm election, or is it the final gasp of a drowning ethos of a white, heterosexist, patriarchal America finally succumbing to the demographic wave that I mentioned earlier? Your guess is as good as mine. After this, heck, I won't even prognosticate within the safe walls of my own home. But it seems to me that it's the 2 years will be the make or break, because he's got that carte blanche.
Because there's no denying that he is not just a blip on the timeline, that he is significant, meaning Donald Trump here. And, we had a conversation late last week, I should say, where we were discussing about rationality and realism, and how using our rational brain, it's difficult, and using all of the techniques and tools that we would have that are at our disposal from experience and analysis against this unfathomable outcome on the basis of rationality. So within that, there will be a rational explanation, I suppose, at the key of it, the base of this. This is what we are attempting to get on the record now. But there is very little time space with trying to understand this. Perhaps some of the answers are within populism itself. That's understood a lot more. But Trumpism is also different to populism, I'd argue. And within that, I guess what the question you're putting there is the test as to whether or not Trumpism can be exported within the United States beyond Trump. And certainly the test would be at the midterms in 2 years' time in the States itself. But perhaps it is like in countries like in the UK, countries like France on the continent, the European continent, in Germany, we see South Africa, we see India, we see major, strong democracies around the world, but also in New Zealand. Perhaps we will see it in Australia next year, that this anti-incumbency perhaps is an all-powerful movement in itself that needs to factor into the populism. It needs to factor into the essence of Trumpism. And perhaps that anti-incumbency, for all of the reasons we're identifying here, class estrangement, economic indicators not actually reaching those in the lower socioeconomic and who perhaps arguably would have the lion's share of vote proportion. Certainly we can see those indicators. But at the same time, there is a gender divide. There is an evidence in this vote. You can see at every level how women were concerned with Trump, perhaps not for the reasons that many of us would have thought prior to the election. But in those exit polls, and they're notorious for being less accurate, aren't they? Exit polls from the point of view of early on election nights around the world, are they going to give us an indication of the outcome? And quite often they are flawed. But perhaps in this case, and I've gone through them, they can. There's some real good data there to try and fathom for those that are real political junkies. Probably the easiest way to access these exit polls is to go to the ABC. I'll bring it across here. And you can see, like where we brought up the maps earlier on, you can see up here, you can see exit polls, and you can go to these states. There's 10 states that they have highlighted there where exit polls are showing good data. And in there you can see a lot of answers. So if those political junkies that are watching this want to dig down into that, no doubt you'll find some answers in there. But Paul, how before we get on to transition and those that are going to be representing the Trump administration, how do you feel the rest of the world is adjusting to the reality of Trump being the president of the United States for the next 4 years?
Okay, let me just say before I move on, the one thing that triggered this thought is that when you mentioned women, that was another thing. Gender didn't matter. I thought that the repudiation of the repeal of Roe versus Wade would have made women the decisive actor. As it turns out, for women, the two priority subjects were immigration and inflation. Reproductive rights came a distant third, excuse me, and in some red states, it didn't matter at all. So Christian women, for example. And what they tell us, and you and I know this, academics should know this, women are not a homogeneous lot. Duh.
Yeah. No one is, are they? No one.
But even I succumbed to the temptation to say, oh no, this one, my daughter and my granddaughter, their future, blah, 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 blah. And it didn't matter. Women had other priorities. And so I just wanted to get that out there because you were mentioning polling. And I think, a lot of the polling is still a bit too crude. They're trying to get better and better. But, they're still not capturing, the nuances.
They're not, Paul, are they? Like when you look at the polls, despite putting differentials in or calculations or formula, that you get your response, putting it simply, you get your response from this scope of number of people. And so you multiply it by a formula with Trump to try and accommodate this deficit that you've had in the past. And there's many other parts of formula to try and correct the polls. What it's doing, you're right, it's crude in the sense that there's this unknown. It's a known unknown that you're not reaching accurate responses from people. So simply multiply it with a formula so that it gets closer to Trump. And then there's this angst, wasn't there, in leading up into election day, where you think everybody's thinking, pollsters included, have we overcalculated? Is she going to have a landslide here? And that started to creep in when you saw, for example, in Pennsylvania, 10 days out from the election, you saw Trump getting ahead. And why is this? Only in the last 2 days, you see the probability kind of things like 538 adjusting back toward a Kamala Harris potential win in those last few days of polls that were picking up that she was getting a little bit of a lift. But, clearly, and I know here in New Zealand, Keith Rankin, primary amongst others, is really looking at why did the polls get it wrong again? I've got to say, and just a bit of a hat tip to Keith, early on election night, he said Trump's going to win all 7 states. And I was struggling with that internal logic bias that you've spoken about. And I was thinking, no, I can't see him losing Wisconsin, but of course he did. I mentioned to you about 2 months ago on our podcast when we were looking at the United States elections back then that I thought there were worrying signs in Nevada because of the makeup, the working class, the class issue, the issue of alienation. But we both landed on the thing like, probably not. No, Nevada wouldn't go where it has, but without rubbing salt in both of our eyes and many other people. I just wanted to bring that part in and just park it and let you be able to move on. And perhaps, any of these elements that start to I'd imagine that when the midterms are coming up and we do a podcast on that, we'll be evaluating what we're discussing today to see what we can potentially get a grip of as that comes forward. Midterms, of course, won't be a test on Trump, and that's a factor too, isn't it?
Yeah, it could be. Indirectly, it could be. It depends on, I mean, his domestic agenda.
Indirectly. I was meaning
stayed,
more that he's not the top of the ticket, so, that's slightly different in that respect.
Right. But certainly if they control both houses of Congress and he can get his legislative agenda easily through both, then it does become an indirect test of him. And remember, his domestic agenda is very ambitious. He wants to deport 11 million people, including U.S. citizens. That's a big ask. I mean, it won't be for
billions
lack
of dollars, isn't it?
Right. It won't be for lack of trying, but it looks like he's going to try. He's going to get into all sorts of constitutional issues if he tries to use the military, stack the military with loyalists. They're supposed to be neutral professionals. I mean, I could go on and on. The tariffs. The tariffs nominally will punish the very people who voted for him. Yeah. But again, vulgar Marxists will tell you that all of this can be explained by false consciousness. These people vote against their interests because they're deluded by these superstructural things. They're hating on Mexicans. They're hating on transgender. I don't know. I think it's a little more complicated. I'll have to go brush up on my Antonio Gramsci. But I do remember Gramsci, when he was looking at the rise of Mussolini, he noted that it was working class men, particularly unionists, who were Mussolini's black shirts, and that Hitler's brown shirts were actually lower middle class, the shopkeeper class, and union members. And so those classic theorists who wrote about European fascism, not to confuse with the stupidity of calling Trump a fascist in this day and age, they saw it as the working class movements. And Trump, he tapped into that. And so that's something to keep in mind. And particularly Democrats need to keep in mind is that, be it populists like we have with Trump and some of the Latin American authoritarians, or be it European fascists, it was the working classes that propelled them to victory. And so they need to wise up. Now, with regards to international relations, very interesting. I think on the one hand, liberal democracies are under siege, as you well put out. There's this populist wave. Trump himself refers to Viktor Orban in Hungary as an example. There's a lot of truth in that. I think that the liberal democratic world is going to have to adopt various hedging strategies. What they may be, I mean, we'll come back to New Zealand in a second. But the contrast is made with authoritarians. Authoritarians around the world are rejoicing, except for the Iranians. And by the way, the Iranians actually do hold elections. They're semi-competitive, so they're repressive, but there's others far worse. Those guys like Trump. Now, there's two things that I think are very significant. They've happened in the last 48 hours or so. On the one hand, Trump has talked with Netanyahu. And basically, it appears that he has given Netanyahu carte blanche to eliminate the Palestinians. I fear for the Palestinians because I think Trump doesn't care what Netanyahu does to them. And again, I think terrible things are. If we think what has been bad so far is going to stop, we'd be very mistaken with Trump.
And we see members of the Netanyahu coalition government actually openly using the word cleansing with respect to Gaza. So we know.
No, I fear they're going to go for it, not only in Gaza, but in the West Bank. And then they'll create that buffer zone in southern Lebanon. Anyway, they're going to go for it, to include possibly provoking Iran. I think that the idea is if you're going to hit Iran hard, this is the time. They're on their back heels. They've suffered a number of tactical defeats. They're clearly intimidated by the tit for tat with the rockets. Some of the hawks in the U.S. as well as in Israel say this is the time to hit them. They still don't have a nuke, and so go for it.
See, and this is an issue where Pompeo was obviously the Secretary of State in the Trump administration, was positioning to be Secretary of Defense, but he's pro-NATO. Just to pick up one issue, and perhaps has more of a conscience in this Gaza-Israel war. Trump's overnight, Trump ruled him out of being a part of his administration, along with Haley. But we can get into that a little bit more. But these are signals, aren't they? And they're supporting what you're saying here, really.
Well, I'll give you a signal. This is my second authoritarian remark. Over the weekend, the mainstream Russian press, its main mouthpieces, published nude photos of Melania Trump. Older photos, but she's buck naked and in poses that are, have little decorum for a first lady of the United States. I see that as leverage. Putin gave the order, put her bare ass out there as a reminder to Trump that if his people start pushing back at us, I got a lot more dirt where that came from, and a lot of it is on you, brother. So I think he sent out a not too subtle signal to Trump that he better watch his P's and Q's. Because the wife, that's in her past and whatnot. But Trump may have things closer to the present day that are more compromising than some nudie pics. That was not too subtle. But then again, Trump doesn't understand subtlety. So I think Putin gave him a warning about limits to you talking bad about Russia and pushing back on us. And of course, that has an impact on Ukraine. And the hedging strategies of the democracies have to involve the recognition that they're on their own. That if Ukraine is going to succeed, it will be NATO, not the United States, that provides the support for it to succeed. That's an open question, Selwyn. There's already divisions within NATO about whether to cut bait and leave or to do what Trump is suggesting, which we talked about 2 years ago, which is you're going to have to give Putin a slice of Ukrainian territory in order for him to leave. That's his way out.
And you're talking about the Dnipro River, the Donbass to the east of that. That's what Putin wants, but arguably. That's what they're fighting over overnight. There's 50,000 troops, a mix of Russian Federation soldiers, North Korean soldiers that are positioned to make a move there should they have to. There's been an escalation in drone and missile attacks from Russia to Ukraine cities, but also the other way around too. It seems to be heating up. One gets a sense that both sides are trying to advance or hold ground in Ukraine's sense for the Russians to advance prior to some sort of negotiation that may or may not take place. We know on the weekend that Trump spoke directly to Zelensky, that we know that he passed the phone to Elon Musk. One would presume he was talking in the context of Musk's Starlink providing communications for Ukraine on a US defense budget. In the absence of Ukraine's own infrastructure, it has been essential in the battlefield for Ukraine. So what the outcome of that was is anyone's guess, but you get a sense that they are positioning to map out exactly what they need to if they're going to enter into some sort of negotiation, whatever shape that may be.
Yeah, I think you're right. Basically, they're fighting over territory before the inauguration day, right? Because the inauguration day, the battle lines will be those that are negotiated. So the Ukrainians want to push east. The Russians want to push west. Remember that the Donbass region is both the breadbasket and a mining center for Ukraine.
Yeah.
So it's resource rich. And that's why the Russians want it so much. Besides the fact that there are ethnic Russians living there, the whole point of this is to move the line one way or another so that when Trump comes in, that's the negotiating starting point. But other countries have to worry, other democracies. Taiwan, I would say right now, is having sleepless nights because Trump is very transactional. And if he gets from China economic concessions because of the tariffs and whatnot, I wouldn't put it past Trump to say, what exactly is our interest in Taiwan?
Yeah.
There's this renegade province. Sure, they got lots of chips, but we're making chips at home now. So what's it to
Yeah.
us?
What's in it for him, personally too,
Yeah.
which is a big part of it. Which raises questions about, well, what about AUKUS? What about the Quad? And we'll no doubt pick up the Quad pretty soon, won't we, once we get to see who's representing the administration. And what do the English do? The English, I think, are fast realising that in the list of countries that may have consideration for Trump as he goes forward, the European Eurozone states, like the ones we've just talked about, Britain doesn't even come into it. So what's the special relationship that is supposed to, and well heralded from the United Kingdom side? I think it's what's very clear is there are relationships that are way up the pecking order, and Britain's starting to think to itself, maybe we shouldn't have estranged ourselves diplomatically so much from the European voice when Brexit forced us out on issues relating to membership. So that might be another episode for another time, should events start to shape in a way that elevates its consideration. Fascinating time. Taiwan, yep, that has a great, so many consequences for the Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific region as a whole with respect to it. Then, Paul, we mentioned isolationism at the beginning of this. Does Trump regress back into himself, not just with domestic manufacturing, but geopolitically too, putting to bed the World War II ethos, if you like, of the United States being and attempting to hold on to being the single most prominent hegemony, or the Leviathan, to go back on the old type of strategies. And put simply, where if you have a nation in the world that is the Leviathan, this major big power, that in itself can suppress the regional conflicts around the world and establish some sort of version of peace. But those things seem to have gone with Trump, don't they? We're returning back to post-World War II thinking. So maybe with the geopolitical considerations, can I just hand it back to you with isolationism being in the mix as well?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's be very clear on what what is being destroyed. That liberal international order. Trump will finish it off. He doesn't believe in multilateral institutions. He doesn't believe in even the liberal ones, sort of like the WTO and the World Bank. He doesn't believe in them. His policies will be neo-isolationist. And here's where it gets interesting. He is not going to be completely isolationist across the board. He's going to be interventionist in areas and countries where he feels that it is beneficial to him or to the interests that surround him, including some that may not be economic. So he may treat Brazil differently than he treats Venezuela or Argentina. Within a region, he'll pick and choose how he's going to approach these people. What I would call it, and this comes from a think tank scholar in the United States, you and I have talked about the constellations. We're moving to a multipolar, it's actually a bipolar world full of different constellations. This scholar whose name I can't remember, she had a better word for it, multi-alignment.
Ah,
And her point was, you're now aligning yourself in different directions. I like it. That's what Trump's going to do. He will align himself with authoritarians if it's in his economic interests. Let's say, for example, even though there may be egregious human rights violations and all sorts of strangeness in Uzbekistan or Tajikistan or Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, there's oil and mineral wealth there. And so he may see it advantageous to cast a blind eye on their various violations of domestic and international law because he can cut a deal on these raw materials. That could be possible. On the other hand, he may come down very hard on liberal democracies that oppose him. And so I can see him attacking Spain or France or, some of the liberal European polities and hurting them diplomatically or militarily, because, again, they're NATO members, by cutting off sales to them of, weaponry and that sort of thing. So I think we're going to get a major shakeup. And again, that goes to the hedging strategies, which is, I guess the Europeans are going to have to look at themselves. I am prepared for Trump to come to New Zealand as a NATO partner and say, you've got to up your GDP spending on the military to 2% minimum, or I'm going to cut you off.
And imagine what will be applied to the Albanese government over there in Australia.
Yeah, the Australians are already over 2% for their own reasons. And I'll say something briefly about that. But we are not. We're at 1.5%. And but remember that when our troops go overseas, for whatever reason, we do have now some new C-130s, but a lot of our logistical needs are met by the Australians and the Americans. I can see the Americans withdrawing that sort of help and just saying, you can hitchhike on your way over to peacekeeping somewhere. The Albanese government is clearly going to be on the outers. If I was one of Trump's advisors, and if he appoints Robert O'Brien, he's not going to appoint him Secretary of Defense because he wants his little freaks to be over there. But O'Brien was his national security director for a while. In that crowd, he's pretty reasonable compared to the freaks. If Robert O'Brien has influence, he's going to say to Trump, look, it's cost effective to do AUKUS because then the Australians will be on the front lines. They're going to be the guys looking at the Chinese very closely. And we can back them up, but we don't have to do the patrols in the South Pacific. We can divert our nuclear subs elsewhere. And so I think he's going to sell it as a cost-benefit thing. Bolster this. Now, you're absolutely right. I think the English, they're on the outers, especially under the Starmer government. And so Trump may say, yeah, but these British guys, they're getting a slice of the pie off of the AUKUS investment. I don't like that. They're not doing anything. And so we could see some modifications, but not necessarily with the relationship with Australia. And again, New Zealand's going to be on the outside looking in no matter what happens. But I can see if we don't meet his goals, that he will punish us. There'll be punitive measures taken against us, which has to force New Zealand, with its much vaunted so-called independent foreign policy, to reconsider its options. I know right now, this center-right going further to the right coalition government that we have.
I'd argue with shades of Trumpism.
It does. It has shades of Trumpism. They're basically now kissing the ring. I mean, I hate to say it, but New Zealand's position as a small state is, I'm being polite here, kissing the ring. You get my drift. They're supplicants.
Yeah, it's Pope Trump. With his hand out. And the sycophantic leadership of New Zealand's current government kissing the ring.
Yes. And so they may get some short-term benefit off of that. And it's like Wall Street. Wall Street rebounded and spiked right after the election. That's short-term opportunists going for it. I watched the currency markets. It was interesting to see the fluctuations.
The shift to crypto. Of course, Trump had endorsed crypto as a principle in the campaign. It is at record highs. A lot of people in that conundrum: do they hold on to where it is now and try and bank that in, or do they cash in their chips before the slide? But we saw that in the first term. We saw the staccato patterns within the currency markets, with the US being the base currencies, etc. I guess with respect to that part, and we won't dig in, I'm sure, but China's response will dictate the strength or otherwise, I think, of the currencies of Asia Pacific. So that will be interesting to see how Trump's appointments in those areas and how they operate. Just on appointments, just as a thing, and I wanted to test your responses. We're hearing, whether or not it happens or not is another thing, but we're hearing from the United States that Marco Rubio is positioning and is a contender for Secretary of State. That has huge consequences all over the world. But what are those consequences? We know that Trump referred to Rubio as Little Rubio, particularly in the first primary of the first term, positioning for that. So what does that mean if someone like Rubio is in contention? Trump has not ruled him out. Let's say that at this juncture. What's that mean?
Well, I mean, first of all, Rubio's public interest tells us that he knows his days as a senator are numbered. His margins of victory have gone down. He squeaked by this time. But Marco's reading the tea leaves and he knows he's on his way out. So the best way to go out is to add another, gold plate to his portfolio, which Secretary of State would be. The trouble is, a Secretary of State for Donald Trump, with Donald Trump's ignorant mindset. I don't mind saying that because the guy really, he's just a bully. He doesn't know much about a lot of things. Rubio's not that conversant in world affairs either. Sure, he's a Cuban American, so he speaks Spanish. He thinks he knows Latin America, but quite frankly, the Miami-Dade area is a bubble of right-wing Latinos who are not like Mexicans, are not, like Argentines. I mean, there's many of them there, but that's an epicenter of reaction. Now with Venezuelans fleeing the Chavez Maduro regime added to the Cubans. So we'll see. I mean, he could get it, but I don't think he's going to be a moderating influence on Trump. See, what we want, and they tried it in the first administration, was buffers or guardrails, adults in the room. And It turns out there was no holding them back. I mean, apparently they did things behind the scenes. The key person to keeping this guy in his lane,
I know where you're going,
is his chief of staff. Susie
and
Wiles.
that appointment, I remember on the weekend, I said, it looks like Susie Wiles has got this. And your response, I'm sure you won't mind me saying, was, well, that's quite wise.
Absolutely. I mean, and for the New Zealanders who are listening to us, it's not the Susie Wiles of COVID fame here in New Zealand. No, she was an excellent campaign manager. I don't know if she was the one who came up with "Go for the Angry," young men, but she definitely had a hand in trying to impose some discipline and keep the talking points. And given how much he ranted and lunatic raved, that must have been quite the task. But in the end, it was extremely successful. And the big loser for Susie Wiles moving to the White House is Ron DeSantis.
Because she helped get in, didn't she? In Florida, she was this stabilizing influence on his campaigns, but it opened it up for Trump in the primaries, and he made the mistake of going hard against Trump.
And the Trump team poached her. Poached her out of DeSantis's office after she had helped him win the governorship. It's rough in politics, but she's very good at what she does. And she's actually got a lieutenant, another woman, who likes to stay behind the scenes. Pardon if I don't remember her name. But this is a lady who, she's sort of the fixer. So if you think of Pulp Fiction and the Harvey Keitel character who comes on and cleans up messes and stuff, that second woman is the one who, like when he goes off script and stands around. Well, I'll give you an idea. There's some reason to believe that when he froze at that one rally for 20 minutes or whatever it was, he actually was having a full Joe Biden type meltdown. And this second woman apparently knew that the way to wake him up was to play a playlist of his favorite hits. And so YMCA,
the village people, you know, the songs of his relative youth, and
it woke him up. And even though he didn't remember where he was in the script, the music got him moving, and it was his own personal playlist. But she had the quickness of thought, if these stories are true, to say, hit the playlist, hit the play, because otherwise he's catatonic. And then he woke up and he eventually went back to his speech. Well, if she did that, that's brilliant. Okay, your candidate is, frozen on stage, and you wake him up with some of his favorite hits. Well, if she comes to the White House, they have the beginnings of a formidable machine, and I'll give them credit. First female chief of staff, not on my side, but finally, that glass ceiling's getting broken through.
I took the opportunity last night, New Zealand time, to look at some footage that was fly on the wall kind of video footage that obviously inside Trump's office, surrounded by his people. Susie Wiles is there, but very quiet, just monitoring what's going on, obviously pulling people in line if she needs to. And what I was interested in was watching exactly what you're talking about there, and also what kind of influences were on Trump, if any, and Trump's interaction with his team. Now, we saw like what we've seen the mooch describe, all the bravado. It's always got to be about Trump. Everyone's got to address his vanity to make sure everything is working well. But his attention and things like that was extremely sharp, I've got to say. What he was responding to was the DNC's main event when Kamala Harris is speaking at the DNC, the convention, really kicking off her campaign. And she said a lot of thank yous. And if Trump's people, Trump himself, are watching Fox, and he's counting, not obviously, but he's going, you can see every thank you, she says, and then bang, he hits with how many thank yous, and he says, that's weird, put this out on Truth. And he's got his person, and then he's dictating in real time the responses going out on Truth. Now, that's something we've heard that we didn't realise perhaps from the first term campaign, that he has political instincts that you can't underestimate. I don't want to return us back to the beginning of this podcast where we were evaluating the Democratic response, but maybe that's a big part of it too. Don't underestimate this guy. But that leads to other questions. His first term with Bannon and others all around in the early stages particularly was one of chaos. And out of the chaos they could control, it appeared. And I remember you and I talking about this on podcasts around the end of that time. Now, with this, are we going to see the same? The appointments like Susie Wiles, are they going to be the type of appointments that are made where this guy, he decides, well, I've made history, I've moved the United States to a position where we think, I'm going to go and play golf and leave these grown-ups in the room to run the country? Or is he going to push through 2025? And I've got to say, thanks to Matt Robson for sending me through the full document the other night. It's going to take a lot more digesting, but it's a relevant document now that it's a living beast, isn't it?
Well, let's put it this way. There are reports that Susie Wiles has already put out notice that the clown show is over. And by that, what she meant is you're not going to have these hangers-on like Mike the Pillow Man, Rudy Giuliani, all these nutters, Kanye West. They're not welcome in the White House anymore. Okay? They're not getting a pass. They're not coming. Because that chaos that you describe, it turns out, was much worse than we could have imagined. These guys were roaming the halls of the White House, saying stupidities, and whatnot. And then they'd see him, and they would kiss his ring. But then they'd wander around demanding things, and it was a clown show. She said, no. The only people coming in here, particularly to the West Wing, are political professionals. Distinguished guests, so we have a foreign head of state, but no more sideshow. Not at all. These guys are gone. And that may include Steve Bannon. You know, he got himself in trouble on behalf of Trump, but he may
Sloppy
not be.
Steve is what Trump calls him. Sloppy Steve. Yeah.
Well, he may not come back. I mean, he's out of jail now. He's still loyal to Trump, possibly because he has his own agenda. But she's going to impose order and discipline. And, you know, it's the velvet glove approach. Instead of yelling at people, getting all macho man, she can let Trump be the macho man. And then she's like the school marm or the maternal figure who goes, you know, this is not the place for you. You know, you could be more helpful if you get out there on the hustings and rant and rave, you know, at a rally somewhere, but not in the White House.
How will she control what at this juncture appears like the mega wealthy, the Elon Musks, perhaps Thiel, positioning in some sort of, look, I'm not characterizing it or attempting to define it here, but perhaps attaching to an administration in a way that we've seen oligarchs do in the Russian Federation, attaching to the nucleus of where consolidated wealth is achieved. And what's your view on what we are seeing at this moment? What's your opinion?
Well, I think that they are very transactional. By they, I mean Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and then other billionaires. They want something out of Trump. Now, Musk, I think, was instrumental in his success, again, using his platform. He's got a lot of contracts with the U.S. government. He expects a return on his political investment, and he will get it. Thiel, who I might add, for those who don't know, is also South African in origin. Both Musk and Thiel are Afrikaners.
And a New Zealand citizen of note.
Oh, yeah, he bought his way into New Zealand. Yeah. Okay, so good old New Zealand, you know, if you flash the cash, you're welcome in. But
hat tip to John Key.
He was the intermediator, the facilitator. Some would say the pimp, but that would be rude. Thiel's got a different project. Thiel's project is to advance J.D. Vance into the presidency.
Yeah, he bankrolled him, didn't he?
J.D. Vance is Peter Thiel's boy toy.
Yeah.
You know,
without Thiel, he arguably wouldn't have made the VC position.
Well, he might not have made the Senate. I mean, that's why, you know, his campaign was bankrolled by Thiel, much the way these billionaires bankrolled Trump in this one. No, Thiel's got bigger, more long-term ambitions. And the idea is that Trump is suffering from cognitive decline. That's obvious. And it will inevitably get worse. There's only so much Adderall you can pump into a human being before things like the catatonia set in. And so the rumor mongering that I've heard is that they're going to let Trump deteriorate and then they're going to Article 25 him. Article 25 of the Constitution is where a president is removed because of physical or mental unfitness. Article 25 is voted on by members of the president's cabinet. So it's not Congress, it's his cabinet. And so Thiel will jockey hard, if all of this is true, to have cabinet members appointed that share his vision or at least will be sympathetic to the idea when it comes that Trump has to go because Vance is a sharper engine.
Yeah, on that argument, if you think of it like a chessboard, it is at that juncture where they move their piece, that is J.D. Vance, into position. And the argument would be in countering that and pushing back on that is clearly Trump is not happy with him, and will Trump dispose of him sooner rather than later? But the Thiel insurance may be the difference to that, is what you're arguing.
I think no, your point's very well taken, because Trump, he can smell threat.
Yeah.
And he can smell threat coming up behind him, which is Vance. Very good point. On the other hand, you just made a second good point, which is Thiel is Vance's insurance policy.
Yeah.
And he's invested a lot in this presidency. He will let Trump know that any move against Vance will be considered a move against Thiel. And if you remember that both of these guys, Thiel and Musk, at one point were Democrats, or at least supported Democratic candidates in the early Silicon Valley days in California, then you know that political allegiance is not their strong suit. They're political opportunists. They're going where their money speaks the loudest. And so that the aggregate sum of your good points is that these could be the fractures, excuse me, in the incoming Trump administration between people who are not loyal to Trump for Trump's sake, but who see him merely as a vehicle to longer term ends. And certainly in the case of Thiel, I would reckon that that's likely the case. Musk is more enigmatic because I said this to some friends, because someone was saying, look, you got to understand, Musk is on the spectrum of autism.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, besides the fact that that's an insult to autistic people, I tend to think of him as an idiot savant. He is really good and has incredible vision when it comes to cars and rockets and, Neuralink. Incredible, and he knows how to appoint people and put money into incredible things.
Yeah.
That does not make him a political genius. To the contrary, he thinks he's the smartest man in the world as well as the richest man in the world. And he thinks politicians are all rubes, just fools who can be bought. And in the case of Trump, he might be correct. But he's
Well,
not the smartest man in the
you
world.
can no. Well, politically is a different kettle of fish, isn't it? There's so much subjectivism to it, and it's finite. Everyone loses at some stage, whether it's by their own choice or constitutional or by the ballot box. So I wonder whether or not this is all about procurement, which takes us back to the models that you can see from the authoritarian states like in Hungary, but mostly Russian Federation, where the direct control of that procurement arguably can come from the authoritative leader, in this case, potentially Trump. And the beneficiaries of that, it's not necessarily a stable footing, but for as long as they can keep their teeth in or fangs in to the procurement pipeline, they're satisfied. And if you look at what Musk did under the Joe Biden and arguably before that too, administration, he picks up contracts where NASA would have once dominated within the space areas. He picks up Starlink with defence contracts with respect to Ukraine, maybe other theatres of conflict too. Those are just two where he's a major beneficiary. If you look at Thiel, it's not lost that on election night it was mentioned about how strong and glorious Palantir was, which is Thiel's area. You're talking space deterrence there in weaponry and AI in a major way. And Paul, you and I did a whole program on this kind of stuff with respect to advancements of hybrid and AI warfare. So, those are the areas perhaps that we will have a better grip on as we go forward in the early stages of the Trump administration. But we do get a sense that things are moving fast. Not like last time where it was held up by way of the vetting systems, the justice vetting systems on individuals, and holding up appointments that Trump wanted, for months, and goes in on after being inaugurated, and he still hasn't filled some positions. We get a sense now that he's intolerant to that, thinking, no, we'll have our own vetting, thank you very much, and these are the people we're going to line up here. So there's something quite different in the front end of this that we didn't see in the last one. What it really all means is, I guess, is going to yet be told, isn't it? But Paul, just before we wrap, and I'll pass it back to you for anything that you would like to inject in at this stage in it and to discuss. There's a few great comments, only a few. Tamatea Curtis, and he says, and he's having a bit of a laugh here at the beginning of the podcast, too true, Paul. Who knew Hulk Hogan was so effective? And that's when you dropped in that mention of Hogan. You've got Daryl here who's saying, are we wrong in viewing this from a left-right political perspective? Was this result class and culture over traditional left-right norms? That's what we've been really trying to test out here today, haven't we, Daryl? And Daryl, once again, putting the question here, does the left need to move away from political elites and find a candidate that normal voters feel they can relate to? Perhaps the Democrats reached their zenith in that, not with Obama, with his broad coalition, but when they had Bill Clinton, who could speak with absolute directness to anyone, whether or not they were from the lowest socioeconomic areas in the United States to the most lofty. And also he was able to give responses on issues relating to race without the cringe of, oh, I can't say that. It just won't be accepted by the party. And maybe that's what Daryl is touching on here. Someone who's brave enough to be, speak from the gut, be on the right side of history, not necessarily an antagonist and all of the negative kind of personality traits that we have seen in those who are victorious in this election, but something that is a little bit more representative. Maybe the Fetterman type of thing is not necessarily the model for presidency candidates, but the authentic voice that Fetterman brought to Pennsylvania may be the kind of thing of true representation. Maybe that's it. Oh, and there's a late comment that has come through here. How from the US nuke sponge, 5NZ is the title, quite a mouthful. How much of it is procurement contracts on rails pushing this fascist turn like World War I rails? I shy away from the fascist labels, to be honest, and Paul and I did early on a few months ago too, where we didn't buy into that, and Paul gave very good reasons for it at that time. But yeah, take your point, and thank you for your comments there. Paul, back to you last week.
Yeah, I think that obviously this is a watershed moment for the American left. Now, I'll point out, just as a brief aside, a lot of criticism of Kamala Harris and her campaign strategy. And I would simply say this, because they asked her, would she do anything different than the Biden administration? And she said no. And that apparently did her a lot of harm in the last 2 weeks. I think what happened with Harris was, given the circumstances of Biden's departure, she had a lot of respect for him. So she wasn't going to pull out the rug from under him by immediately, let's say, taking a different tact when it came to Palestine. She wanted the continuity to honor Biden's legacy, which by all objective measures, with the exception of the Israel-Palestine conflict, has been quite good. Again, I was thinking about college debt relief. The amount of people that he's actually helped. So she deferred to Biden's legacy when, in fact, she should have done a sharp break and broken to the left on what we were calling corporate democratic issues. Make the break with the Clintons. Make the break. And you're absolutely right about Bill being able to, touch the hearts of people big and small. Break the hold the Obamas have on the Democratic Party, and she couldn't do that. Be it as it may, the trouble here is what the Democrats need is a Bernie Sanders, except he's too old. They need a young activist who can talk class issues in ways that don't sound Marxist. See, there's the conundrum. In the United States, and to a lesser extent here, if you start talking about class, the class line, that in fact redneck workers and black workers and Latino workers have a common enemy, and it's called Elon Musk or one of these characters, that the working classes have more in common than they do things that divide them. if you can speak that way and it resonates, there will be success. But instead, thanks to the Clinton Obama eras, the Democratic Party's gone off into identity.
Yeah.
And what I think,
Identity beyond third way. Maybe Bill
yeah,
led the thing with too much corporatization, of which Hillary exemplified later on, but maybe.
yeah, no, I mean, I've thought about this a lot in terms of if you have an identity, but you've got your feet grounded in your class position,
Mm.
right? So I'm Italian, but I'm working class Italian. I'm not Martin Scorsese or
Yeah.
Robert De Niro. No, I'm a stevedore. That might resonate. In fact, here in New Zealand, my former colleague at Kiwi Politico, Lou Stoddard, he is a very articulate defender of identity politics. He was raised as a Maori, even though he's a Pakeha guy. Incredibly articulate, but he and I argued all the time because I was saying, look, you can't push identity politics without the class line. And Lou felt very sincerely, and he's no fool. Lou's a very smart guy.
Yeah.
He was like, at least for Maoridom, Pacifica people, and then now, again, sexual orientation people, it doesn't matter what class they're in. They're either discriminated or oppressed because of who they are
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
outside of the productive apparatus. And that we may not be able to solve that. But I think what happened was the Democratic obsession with identity, which again, they simply saw as giving civil rights to previously marginalized people. That was it. They weren't trying to change the nuclear family. It turns out that any school in the United States that receives federal funding had to provide for gender affirmation, all that stuff that conservatives got all worked up about. That was a proviso of the Education Act and those sort of things, which made it a national issue. And boy, oh boy, was that a mistake because again,
Mm.
it's blown back onto them in a big way. And if anything, transgender rights are going to be set back as a result of this election. Remember,
Absolutely. I'll just add while you're on this particular thing, and then hand it back to you again. There's so much in this election, but with respect to identity, where I'm not an identity politics fan. I always feel that class transcends and interconnects with alliances in an identity kind of way much more powerfully and accurately to get better outcomes and also acknowledge estrangements. But with all of that theory out of the way, I'm reminded here, first off, in that comment that USS Nuke Sponge 5 NZ said here, how much of it is procurement contracts on rails pushing this fascist turn, like World War I rails. Now, you and I pushed back on the fascist term on that when we raised that comment that came in. But then again, our friend here, Sponge5NZ, he pointed out it looks that way to Māori. Thanks for acknowledging. And I get it. I think that it all depends on where you are in your own identity and how you aspire or react to different types of definitions of identity. Without going down that too much, there's one thing that we haven't put there, and I don't want to leave it out. And it was an interview that took place in the last week of the elections up in Michigan. Everyone knew Michigan was starting to look like the Democrats didn't and couldn't hold with confidence. And there was an interview with one of the Democrats' senior people on the ground, a black woman in around about late 40s, early 50s. And she noted that there was messages and discussions in Michigan that she said were putting her black brothers off Kamala Harris as a rational option. And what they were hearing and discussing was information that was circulating that when Kamala Harris was a prosecutor over there in California, that there appeared there was a bias where she sought longer sentences for what the woman said, our black brothers, compared to the white offenders of which she was pushing for sentencing on. She added that the Democrats had all looked into it and she herself was privy to the information and there were no patterns of bias at all. But the sheer fact that the information was there seemed to be having an effect, and it was really underreported. I just wanted to put it out there. I'm reminded in countries like New Zealand, where identity does play a huge factor in our politics, I tend to look at it from the point of view of class and identity as opposed to pure political identity. But you have to acknowledge the power and persuasion of, if you feel you're alienated, my identity is around that. This guy here, quite simply, is listening to me. Those people that say they represent us, they're not. Where's your vote going to go? And it may come down, and all of the looking at this, it may come down to that very simply. Paul, anything else we should pick up on?
No, let me conclude with this. One is just an observation about class versus identity. In my academic career, I wrote in a subfield known as labor politics. So I wrote about the relationship between unions and the state in several countries. I started in Latin America, but written about New Zealand, Australia, other places. What was interesting is in the mid-90s, we had a turn to labor internationalism. And it was different than previous eras in that labor unions, let's say here in Australia, in the United States, started forming solidarity alliances, not with other unions abroad. That had already happened throughout the 40s and 50s and 60s. But we're forming alliances with green parties, with feminist movements, youth movements, rainbow movements, and it didn't prove successful. Rather than expand international solidarities between marginalized groups, what it did was it annoyed the rank and file of the original country, because not all workers are enlightened, right? They're low information voters, very bread and butter in orientation. And so what we saw in the late 90s was this backlash against powerful unions, the AFL-CIO in the States, whatever it was called back then in New Zealand, the CTU, I think, where rank and file were like, why are you worried about saving the whales or joining, Inuits, saving walruses and this, that, and the other, when we've got serious issues here on home about workplace safety, keeping up with inflation, bread and butter issues. And I say this as by way of anecdotal comment because this is the problem. If you do a class line and you're sincere to it, which again, I agree with you, Selwyn, I think especially if you're going to be a left party, the working class interest is front and center of everything you do, for better or for worse. Once you start getting off into worrying about the plight of other folk, I would say you can do that from a position of strength.
Yeah.
But unions don't
Incumbencies.
determine, right, but they don't determine the phase of capitalism in which they exist. Capitalism evolves according to managerial wishes and the wishes of owners of capital. The unions respond, but their position is always defensive vis-a-vis the capitalist classes. And so if you're in a position of strength, as we have since the so-called neoliberal era, right? Union numbers have gone down. I mean, the US, less than 16% of the entire workforce is unionized, and that's mostly the federal public service who are about to get decimated. And so I think at that point, you've got to pull it in and focus on your bread and butter class interests at home. And then, if you get a chance down the road, expand it out to solidarity with non class based agents like the Greens and others. And in fact, just as a side to the aside, if you want to see where identity politics has taken a party in a terribly wrong direction, just look at the Green Party in New Zealand. What a disaster that's become. But I digress. For me, the bottom line is this, and I'll conclude with this. As I said at the onset, it's all about what doesn't matter. You need to read the terrain, look at it, and then look at what came before and go, celebrity endorsements, they do not matter.
Yeah, that whole
A lot
list
of
of do
money,
not matters that you put out at the
that's
front of
my
the
bottom
program.
line.
Yeah.
That's my bottom line. Trump has taught us what does not matter.
Yeah.
Scratching
And
the itch.
when we're looking at exit polls for data and indicators, sometimes our eyes naturally go to where the biggest numbers were. But in those areas where the Republicans factor less, look at the percentages and where they shifted in the margins on all of these different issues. And that could be the difference between losing the popular vote and winning it. And that's something that's for
Well,
another
I mean,
day.
I'll just say this. I'm sorry if I offend my feminist friends, but reproductive rights did not matter in this election. You know what mattered? The reaction of angry young men. That
Yeah.
mattered.
And to add context to the woman vote on that, remember that Trump is a master at projection. So you say this is an election of importance to democracy. He does too. And for those that voted Trump, you look at some of their reasons, the amount of saving democracy was actually higher than those that voted Democrat that assigned to such logic. But with respect to Roe versus Wade, Trump diverting the responsibility to the states and many of the states having that on the ballot to be decided freed up perhaps a lot of white Republican women to vote against the loss of liberty and abortion and still vote for Trump. And that might be a very, very clever, swift move that allowed them to have their say and in some states to vote it down, vote the Conservatives down on it while still advancing Trump as their option. There we have it.
He had his cake and he ate it too. Hey, listen, I'm
Yeah.
concluding by saying this. Thank goodness the goddess invented magic mushrooms because I'm going to have to take a few hit of those in order to fully comprehend what the heck happened.
Yeah, just don't overeat on that and make sure you choose carefully.
Yeah.
And once again, thanks to those who have commented in here. The last comment there was, how did South America upend Atlas Network, etc.? Perhaps for another day. Paul is a specialist.
Yeah, they did.
And yeah, look at Argentina.
Yeah,
perhaps we didn't. There might be a lot to learn about how Trumpism triumphs by looking at Argentina and what happened there. And Paul's the absolute expert on that. For another time, Paul. To those that have joined us in the live recording of this podcast, thank you very much. And for those that will be listening to it on demand, we appreciate your investment and your time on this program. We will be back at some stage in the very near future, and no doubt we'll be touching on many things that impact geopolitically around the world and certainly trying to define and anticipate what will happen in the months ahead. Until that time, ka kite anō, and we'll talk to you again and see you again later. Thank you, Paul, for your contribution. It was wonderful for the special edition of the United States elections.